She had been invisible to society for years, until the night the Earl asked her to pretend. But when he leaned close, his voice a warm command against her ear, and whispered the one rule she must follow, Armanda Garcia realized pretending might cost her more than her reputation. It might cost her heart. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We did love to hear from you. If you enjoy Victorian-era tale stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The winter of 1815 had been the season of Armanda Garcia's greatest invisibility and most unexpected proposition. At 22 years of age, Miss Armanda, companion to Lady Whitmore and daughter of a late merchant, had settled into London society with no expectations whatsoever. Her father's trade had been respectable but ended with his death. Her position adequate but wholly dependent on her employer's charity. She possessed what her mistress called thoughtful prettiness, warm brown eyes that observed more than they revealed, dark hair that framed delicate features, and a quiet dignity that came from survival rather than privilege. She had not expected to be noticed by Arthur Torres, the Earl of Winterstone, one of the most enigmatic and sought-after gentlemen in England. Yet he had been watching her with an intensity that should have warned her. The afternoon she had defended young Thomas, the footman who had dropped Lady Pemberton's tea service, speaking up when the visiting ladies mocked the trembling boy with cruel laughter. The morning she had read aloud to Lady Whitmore's elderly aunt, her voice steady and kind through hours of Gothic novels. The evening she had stood alone at the window during a dinner party, studying the snow-covered gardens while society danced and schemed inside. "You have courage, Miss Garcia," he had told her one December afternoon in the east study of Winterstone Manor, his dark eyes unreadable. So many young women concern themselves only with advancement and security. You concern yourself with kindness. That is rare, that is valuable. She had allowed herself one dangerous moment to imagine that a man like the Earl might see past her station, might recognize something in her worth noticing. Then reality had reasserted itself with the summons that changed everything. The Earl's steward had appeared at Lady Whitmore's townhouse with a sealed letter. "His lordship requests your immediate presence at Winterstone Manor. A matter of utmost discretion." Armanda had arrived with her heart in her throat, expecting dismissal or worse. Perhaps Lady Whitmore had complained about her. Perhaps she had somehow offended during her brief encounters with the Earl. Instead, she found Arthur Torres standing before the fireplace in his private study, dressed in dark evening clothes that made him look like a figure from a storybook, impossibly handsome, impossibly distant, impossibly dangerous. "Miss Garcia," he had said, his voice like winter silk, "I require your assistance in a matter of some delicacy." She had waited, hands clasped, certain she was about to lose her position. "My family intends to force my hand at the Winterstone Christmas ball," he continued, turning to face her fully. "They have arranged what they believe will be an inescapable betrothal to Lady Caroline Ashworth, a woman I have never met. A marriage designed to consolidate fortunes and political alliances. I will not be maneuvered in this fashion." Armanda had nodded, uncertain why he was confiding in her. Then he had said the words that would unravel her careful, invisible life. "I need you to pretend to be my fiancée, for one night at the Christmas ball." The request had stolen her breath. Her, a paid companion with no family, no fortune, no claim to nobility? Pretend to be engaged to an Earl? "I don't understand, my lord. Why would you choose—" "Because you are outside their schemes," he had interrupted, stepping closer. "Because you owe them nothing, because you are the last person society would suspect, and because—" He had paused, something flickering behind his carefully controlled expression. "Because I trust you." She should have refused, should have recognized the danger. But the humiliation of that afternoon, Lady Pemberton's cold dismissal, the other ladies' mocking laughter, the reminder that she was always just a step above the servants, had left a wound she hadn't acknowledged until that moment. For one night she could be seen. For one night she could matter. "I accept," she had whispered. Arthur Torres had smiled then, a slight, almost hidden expression that should have warned her. "There is one condition," he had said, his voice dropping lower as he moved closer still. "One rule you must follow if we are to convince them." Armanda had waited, her pulse thundering. "If you are to be my fiancée, you must allow me to behave as though you truly belong to me." His gaze had held hers, dark and intent. "You must stay close to me. Let me touch your hand, your waist. Meet my eyes when I speak to you. Look at me as if—" He had stopped, something dangerous crossing his features. "As if your heart were mine." The words had left her breathless, frozen, suddenly aware of how close he stood, of the firelight casting shadows across his handsome face, of the weight of what she had agreed to. "Do you understand, Miss Garcia?" She had understood perfectly. She had understood that this was no longer a simple deception. She had understood that Arthur Torres, Earl of Winterstone, had just made the most dangerous proposition of her life. "I understand, my lord," she had managed, her voice barely steady. But she hadn't understood. Not truly. Not until the night of the ball, when his hand settled possessively at the small of her back, when his eyes followed her every movement with an intensity that made her forget to breathe, when he leaned close in the midst of glittering society and whispered against her ear, "Remember your promise, Armanda. Tonight you belong to me." And in that crystalline moment, surrounded by candlelight and Christmas garlands and the watchful eyes of the tomb, Armanda Garcia realized she had made a terrible mistake. She had agreed to pretend. But nothing about the way Arthur Torres looked at her felt like pretending at all. The silence that followed Arthur's declaration stretched like frost across glass, beautiful, fragile, ready to shatter. Armanda took a step back, her mind racing through a dozen impossible questions. "My lord, I don't— Why would you choose me? I have no title, no family connections, no fortune to speak of. There must be dozens of suitable young ladies who could— Precisely why I cannot ask them." Arthur moved toward the window, his profile sharp against the winter light streaming through the glass. "My aunt, Lady Cordelia Torres, and my cousin, Edmund, have spent the past month orchestrating what they believe will be an inescapable trap. They've invited Lady Caroline Ashworth and her family to the Christmas ball with the explicit intention of forcing an announcement. Lady Caroline's father controls 3 boroughs. Her brother sits in Parliament. The marriage would serve their political ambitions perfectly. But surely you could simply refuse— Not without creating a scandal that would damage Lady Caroline's reputation and hand my cousin ammunition to question my fitness as Earl." His jaw tightened. "Edmund has been waiting for any excuse to challenge my authority since I inherited. A public humiliation of an innocent young woman would give him exactly what he needs." Armanda's hands twisted in her skirt. "I still don't see how I could possibly—" "You are outside their calculations entirely." Arthur turned to face her, his dark eyes intense. "You owe my family nothing. You have no political allegiances, no social ambitions they can leverage. Most importantly, you are someone society has trained itself not to see." The words stung, though they were true. "If I appear with you on my arm," he continued, already engaged, already claimed, "they cannot force my hand. And because you have no family scheming for advancement, no mother pushing you toward a title, they will have no leverage to break us apart before the night ends. But after the ball, when the deception is revealed? By then, Lady Caroline will have been spared the humiliation of a public rejection. She can return home with her dignity intact, and my relatives will have no choice but to accept that I will marry when and whom I choose." He paused. "Or not at all." Armanda shook her head. "My lord, you could choose any woman in London for this. Someone with connections, with grace, someone who knows how to move in your world. I am choosing you." The finality in his voice stopped her protest. Cold. You're the only one I trust not to use this situation for personal gain. The only one whose loyalty cannot be bought or manipulated. Something shifted in his expression. The only one who defended a frightened boy this afternoon when every titled lady in the room found his distress amusing. Heat crept up her neck. He had been watching more carefully than she realized. Arthur stepped closer, and Armanda forced herself not to retreat. If you agree, we must be convincing. We will appear inseparable throughout the evening. I will stay close to you. Touch your hand. His gaze dropped briefly to her waist. Your waist, your back, as any devoted fiancé would. Can you bear that? Her breath caught. The intimacy he described, the touches, the closeness, the pretense of belonging to someone terrified her more than any social humiliation. But then she remembered Lady Pemberton's cold dismissal, the mocking laughter, the endless years of being invisible, disposable, insignificant. For one night, she could matter. For one night, someone would see her. I accept, she whispered. Arthur Torres smiled then, a slight, almost imperceptible curve of his mouth that somehow made him look both triumphant and troubled. Then let us begin your transformation, Miss Garcia. The Christmas ball is 3 days away. The way he said transformation sent a shiver down her spine. She had agreed to pretend to be his fiancé, but as she watched the firelight play across his handsome, unreadable face, Armanda wondered if she had just made a bargain far more dangerous than either of them intended. Winterstone Manor erupted into controlled chaos the moment Arthur issued his orders. A gown for Miss Garcia, he told Mrs. Henshaw, the head housekeeper, his tone brooking no argument. Deep emerald silk, embroidered in silver. I want the finest modiste in London. She is to spare no expense. Mrs. Henshaw's eyes widened. My lord, for the companion. I mean, of course, my lord, right away. The whispers began before Armanda had even left the study. By midday, seamstresses swarmed the manor's guest chambers, pinning fabric against her frame while she stood frozen with mortification. The emerald silk shimmered like water, impossibly rich, impossibly fine, a gown that cost more than she earned in a year. His lordship has very particular taste, the modiste murmured, her knowing eyes studying Armanda with uncomfortable intensity. He specified every detail, the color, the cut, even the silver embroidery pattern. Armanda said nothing, but her cheeks burned. What was Arthur thinking? This extravagance would only fuel speculation, only make the deception more dangerous. The real torment, however, began that afternoon when Arthur summoned her to the ballroom. We must practice, he said simply, as if requesting her to rehearse were the most natural thing in the world. The vast room stretched empty around them, afternoon light streaming through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Arthur stood at the center, impossibly elegant in dark trousers and a crisp white shirt, his coat discarded, his demeanor all controlled focus. Walk toward me. Armanda obeyed, suddenly conscious of every step, every movement. No. His voice stopped her halfway. You walk like a servant trying not to be noticed. That will not do. Heat flooded her face. I'm a servant, my lord. For 3 more days. He crossed to her, and Armanda's breath caught as he positioned himself beside her. Tonight, you are my fiancé, my equal, my choice. His hand settled at the small of her back. Warm, firm, proprietary. Walk with me. They moved across the ballroom floor, and Armanda struggled to focus on anything beyond the heat of his palm against her spine, the subtle pressure guiding her movements. Head up, Arthur murmured. You are not apologizing for your presence. You are permitting others to admire you. I don't know how to... Look at me. She obeyed, tilting her face toward his, and nearly stumbled at the intensity in his dark eyes. When we dance, he continued, his voice dropping lower, When I touch you, when society watches us, you cannot look away. You cannot shrink from me. If you flinch, if you hesitate, they will know this is false." His hand moved from her back to her waist, drawing her closer than propriety allowed. Armanda's pulse thundered. "Practice," he commanded softly. "Meet my eyes. Let me see you." She forced herself to hold his gaze, fighting every instinct to lower her eyes, to retreat into the safety of invisibility. His face was so close. The sharp line of his jaw, the faint shadow of stubble, the way his lips parted slightly as if he might speak. The moment stretched, taut and dangerous. "Better," Arthur finally said, though his voice sounded strained. He stepped back, putting necessary distance between them. "But you must not hold your breath when I touch you. They will notice." "I'm sorry, I—" "Do not apologize." Something flickered across his expression. Frustration, perhaps, or something darker. "Armanda, if we are to succeed, you must understand something. You cannot shrink from me. Not during the ball, not when others are watching, not even when it feels—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "Not even when it feels too real." The admission hung between them like a confession. For the first time, Armanda wondered if this deception terrified him as much as it terrified her. And more dangerously, she wondered why Arthur Torres watched her with such carefully restrained intensity, as if fighting a battle she couldn't see. As if the rule he'd given her, to let him behave as though she belonged to him, was less instruction and more warning for himself. The Winterstone Christmas ball blazed with a magnificence that stole Armanda's breath. Crystal wreaths caught candlelight and scattered it like captured stars across the vaulted ceiling. Garlands of holly and ivy wound through gilded banisters, their dark green leaves studded with white winter roses. Hundreds of candles burned in silver candelabras, casting the ballroom in a warm, golden glow that made everything seem touched by magic. The air itself smelled of pine, cinnamon, and expensive perfume. Armanda stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting on Arthur's arm, and felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes turned toward them. The emerald gown shimmered with every breath she took, the silver embroidery catching light like frost on midnight water. Her dark hair had been dressed with subtle elegance, a few carefully placed pins holding small white roses in place. She looked, she realized with dizzy disbelief, like she belonged here. "Ready?" Arthur murmured, his voice low and steady beside her. She nodded, unable to speak. They descended together. The whispers began immediately, rippling through the crowd like wind across water. "Who is she?" "I've never seen her before." "Is she foreign nobility?" "Where did Winterstone find her?" "Look at the way he's watching her. He has never looked at anyone that way." Armanda felt Arthur's hand tighten almost imperceptibly at her back as they reached the ballroom floor. Ahead, she saw Lady Cordelia Torres, Arthur's aunt, standing rigid with shock, her mouth compressed into a thin line. Beside her, Edmund Torres had gone pale, his handsome face twisting with barely suppressed rage. Arthur guided Armanda forward with calm authority, nodding acknowledgement to guests who parted instinctively to let them pass. His presence commanded the room without effort, and Armanda realized with a flutter of panic that everyone was watching them, studying her, judging her, trying to determine who she was and why the famously aloof Earl of Winterstone held her as if she were precious. "Breathe," Arthur said softly, for her ears alone. She obeyed, drawing in air, fighting the urge to flee. They stopped near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by curious guests, and Arthur turned to face her fully. His dark eyes held hers with that same intensity from their practice sessions, but now, with society watching, the gesture felt infinitely more intimate. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "Remember the rule, Armanda," he murmured, his voice like dark velvet. Look at me as if you belong to me." Her pulse stuttered. This was no longer practice. This was real, the heat of his body so close to hers, the subtle scent of sandalwood and winter air that clung to him, the way his hand rested possessively at her waist. The orchestra began a waltz. Arthur extended his hand. "Dance with me." It wasn't a request. Armanda placed her hand in his, and the ballroom seemed to hold its breath as Arthur drew her into the opening position. His hand settled at her waist, firm and warm, while his other hand held hers with surprising gentleness. They began to move. Armanda had waltzed before. Lady Whitmore had insisted all her companions learn the basic steps, but nothing had prepared her for this. Arthur moved with effortless grace, guiding her through the turns with subtle pressure, his eyes never leaving her face. The emerald gown swirled around her legs, the silver embroidery catching candlelight with every spin. "Everyone is watching," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let them." Arthur pulled her slightly closer than propriety dictated. "They should see exactly what I want them to see." "Which is?" His gaze dropped briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "That you are mine." The words sent heat rushing through her. The chemistry between them crackled like electricity, undeniable and dangerous. Armanda could feel it in the way her body responded to his nearness, in the way his breath quickened almost imperceptibly, in the tension coiling tighter with every turn. Around them, guests openly stared, some with curiosity, some with envy. Lady Cordelia watched with barely concealed fury. Edmund's face had darkened to a dangerous shade of red, but Armanda barely noticed. All she could see was Arthur, the intensity in his dark eyes, the controlled strength in his movements, the way he looked at her as if she truly were the only woman in the room. And when the waltz ended and he lifted her hand to brush his lips across her knuckles, a gesture of possession as much as courtesy, Armanda realized with crystalline clarity that the most dangerous part of their arrangement had nothing to do with society's judgment. It was that nothing about the way Arthur Torres touched her felt like pretending at all. The moment Arthur stepped away to speak with the Duke of Somerset, Viscount Pemberley materialized at Armanda's side like a hawk spotting prey. "My dear lady," he said, his smile practiced and predatory, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Richard Pemberley at your service. Winterstone has been unforgivably selfish, keeping you all to himself." His eyes traveled over her with uncomfortable appreciation. "Might I have the honor of the next dance?" Armanda opened her mouth to decline politely, but a hand settled firmly at her waist. Possessive, unmistakable. "No." Arthur's voice cut through the air like winter steel. Pemberley blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Miss Garcia's dances are all spoken for." Arthur's tone held no room for negotiation. "By me." The Viscount's smile faltered. "Surely one dance wouldn't—" "No?" Arthur's eyes had gone dangerously cold. "Find your amusement elsewhere, Pemberley." The Viscount retreated, but not before shooting Armanda a look of mingled curiosity and pity, as if she were a possession Arthur guarded too jealously. Armanda turned to face Arthur, startled by the tension radiating from him. "My lord, that was rather— I will not share you." The words came out rougher than she'd ever heard him speak. His jaw was tight, his control visibly fraying. "Not tonight. Not with men like Pemberley, who see you as a curiosity to be examined." Something in his intensity made her breath catch. This wasn't performance. This was something raw, something real pushing against the careful facade he'd maintained. Before she could respond, a footman approached with champagne. As Arthur turned to accept the glasses, Armanda caught fragments of conversation from a nearby cluster of ladies. "Nobody, really. A paid companion, I heard. Edmund Torres says she's the daughter of a failed merchant. No connections whatsoever. An opportunist, clearly. Probably manipulated the poor Earl. How else would someone like her catch his attention? It's embarrassing, truly." The words struck like physical blows. Armanda felt the familiar heat of humiliation crawl up her neck, the old instinct to disappear, to make herself smaller, to accept that this was what she deserved. She took a step back, intending to retreat to the edges of the ballroom where she belonged. Arthur's hand caught hers instantly, his grip firm enough to stop her, but gentle enough not to hurt. "Do not run from me." His voice was low, urgent, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made everything else fade. "Armanda, look at me." She forced herself to meet his gaze, fighting the tears threatening to spill. "They're saying they know I'm nobody. Your cousin is telling everyone. I do not care what Edmund says." Arthur stepped closer, his free hand lifting to cup her face with shocking tenderness. The gesture silenced the nearby conversations instantly. "I do not care what any of them think. But the arrangement, the deception, if they discover, let them discover." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, a caress that felt far too intimate for pretense. "Let them whisper and speculate and judge. None of it changes what I see when I look at you." Armanda's breath caught. "What do you see?" Something shifted in Arthur's expression, vulnerability breaking through the controlled exterior like cracks in ice. Someone brave enough to stand here despite their cruelty. Someone who defended a frightened boy when no one else would. Someone He stopped himself, jaw tightening as if he'd nearly revealed too much. "Someone I chose," he finished quietly. "Not by accident, not for convenience. I chose you, Armanda." The rule he'd given her, to let him behave as though she belonged to him, suddenly felt like something else entirely, not instruction, not performance. Truth. His hand remained at her face, his eyes holding hers with an honesty that terrified her. Around them, the ballroom had gone silent, guests openly staring at the Earl of Winterstone touching his mysterious fiancée with a possessiveness that looked nothing like duty and everything like desire. "Stay with me," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please." And Armanda realized that somewhere between the practice, sessions, and the waltz and this moment, the deception had transformed into something neither of them could control, something that felt dangerously, impossibly real. Lady Cordelia's voice cut through the ballroom like a sharp object wrapped in silk. "Arthur, darling, how fortuitous. Your charming companion has wandered directly beneath the mistletoe. You know the tradition must be observed." Armanda looked up sharply. Above her head, suspended from the crystal chandelier by what could only have been deliberate placement, hung a sprig of mistletoe tied with red ribbon. A trap. The realization struck her instantly. Lady Cordelia stood nearby with several other matrons, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and barely concealed malice. Edmund Torres watched from across the room, his smile cold and triumphant. They expected Arthur to refuse, to humiliate her publicly, to prove that his devotion was nothing but performance. The ballroom fell silent, 200 guests turning to witness the Earl's response. Armanda's heart thundered. She should laugh it off, should make some light remark to deflect. Arthur moved. He crossed to her in 3 strides, his expression unreadable, but his eyes blazing with something that looked like barely controlled fury. Before Armanda could speak, before she could breathe, his hands framed her face with startling gentleness. "Arthur," she whispered. He kissed her. Not a polite brush of lips. Not a chaste gesture for appearance's sake. He kissed her with a hunger that stole her breath, his mouth claiming hers with an intensity that made her knees weaken. One hand slid into her hair, careful not to disturb the roses, while the other curved around her waist, pulling her closer. Armanda gasped against his lips, and Arthur took advantage, deepening the kiss with a desperation that felt like drowning and salvation all at once. She could taste frustration, longing, something wild and barely restrained that he'd been holding back for days. The ballroom erupted in shocked gasps and whispers, but Armanda barely heard them. The world had tilted, narrowed to nothing but the heat of Arthur's mouth on hers, the strength of his arms holding her, the way he kissed her as if she were oxygen and he'd been suffocating. This was no act. This was no performance for society's benefit. This was real. When Arthur finally pulled back, his breathing unsteady, his dark eyes searched hers with raw vulnerability. His thumb traced her swollen lower lip, and he leaned close, his words a whisper only she could hear. "Forgive me." That was not pretending. The confession shattered something inside her, every careful wall she'd built, every reminder that this was temporary, that he was an earl and she was nobody, that come morning everything would return to the way it had been. Panic flooded through her. Armanda pulled away from his embrace, stumbling backward, suddenly unable to breathe in the too warm ballroom with its too bright candles and too many staring faces. She saw Lady Cordelia's shocked expression, Edmund's fury, the guests whispering behind gloved hands. She couldn't do this, couldn't stand here and pretend anymore when nothing felt like pretending. "Excuse me," she managed, her voice breaking, and fled. She heard Arthur call her name, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop. She pushed through the crowd, ignoring the startled exclamations, and escaped into the corridor beyond the ballroom. Behind her, Arthur remained frozen at the center of the ballroom, his hands still raised as if reaching for her, his carefully controlled mask finally, completely shattered. He turned slowly to face the staring crowd, and the fury in his eyes made several guests step back instinctively. "The entertainment is concluded," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I suggest you all return to your champagne and gossip. Now." The command in his tone sent people scattering like startled birds. But Lady Cordelia stood her ground, her face pale with rage. "Arthur, this is utterly inappropriate. That girl is—" "Careful, Aunt." Arthur's voice could have frozen fire. "Choose your next words very carefully." Edmund moved to his mother's side, his expression calculating despite his anger. "This charade has gone far enough, cousin. Everyone knows she's a nobody, a paid companion with no family, no fortune. She is mine." The words rang through the ballroom like a bell, and if anyone in this room, family or otherwise, speaks of her with anything less than the respect owed to my future wife, they will answer to me. Am I understood? Silence answered him, Sir. Arthur turned on his heel and strode after Armanda, leaving chaos and stunned whispers in his wake. The Earl of Winterstone had just declared war on his own family, for a woman who was supposed to be nothing but pretense. Armanda found refuge in the conservatory, a glass-walled sanctuary where winter roses bloomed despite the December cold outside. Moonlight filtered through frosted panes, casting silver shadows across the stone floor. She pressed her trembling fingers to her lips, still feeling the heat of Arthur's kiss, still tasting the desperation in it. That was not pretending. The words echoed in her mind, terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. "Armanda." She spun around. Arthur stood in the doorway, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his cravat loosened as if he'd yanked at it in frustration. He looked nothing like the controlled Earl who commanded ballrooms. He looked undone. "Please," she whispered. "Don't. I need to tell you the truth." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The real truth. Not the story I told you about needing someone outside society's schemes. Amanda's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Arthur moved closer, each step deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been watching you for months, Armanda, long before I approached you with this arrangement. The morning you read to Lady Whitmore's aunt with such patience, even when she fell asleep mid-sentence. The afternoon you defended Thomas in front of those cruel women. The evening I saw you standing alone at the window and you smiled, just smiled at the snow falling, as if you could find beauty even in your circumstances." His voice dropped lower, rougher. "You captivated me. Your courage, your dignity, the warmth you showed to people who didn't deserve it. I watched you and I thought—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "I thought I was losing my mind because I couldn't stop thinking about a woman I had no right to pursue." Armanda shook her head, tears threatening. "Then why the arrangement, the deception?" "Because I'm a coward." The admission came out like a confession in church. "I told myself I needed you for the ball, that it was strategy, that I could maintain control if there were rules and boundaries." His laugh was bitter, self-mocking. "The rule I gave you, that you must let me behave as though you belonged to me, it wasn't to convince society, Armanda." He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. "It was to keep myself from slipping, from revealing how desperately I already wanted you, how much I wanted the right to touch you, to hold you, to—" His hand lifted, hovering near her face, but not quite touching. "I thought if I made it a rule, I could maintain distance, could pretend it was all performance. Arthur. But tonight, when Pemberley looked at you with that predatory interest, when I heard them whispering about you, calling you an opportunist—" His control fractured, raw emotion breaking through. "And then that damned mistletoe, my aunt's pathetic attempt to humiliate you." "You kissed me," Armanda finished softly. "I kissed you like I've been dreaming of kissing you for months." His hand finally made contact, fingertips brushing her jaw with aching tenderness. "Like you're mine. Because in every way that matters, Armanda, you are. Not because of any arrangement, not because of any deception, but because I—" The conservatory door burst open. Edmund Torres stood framed in the doorway, his expression triumphant and venomous. Behind him, several guests craned their necks to see inside. "How touching," Edmund drawled, his voice carrying deliberately. "The Earl and his little companion, alone in the dark. Tell me, cousin, does Lady Whitmore know her servant is playing at being a countess? Or should I inform her that her paid companion has been sneaking about Winterstone Manor, seducing her way into—" Arthur moved with lethal speed, crossing the distance and grabbing Edmund by his cravat. "Finish that sentence, and I will destroy you." Edmund smiled coldly despite the threat. "Too late, Arthur. Everyone heard, everyone saw. Your precious arrangement is exposed." His eyes flicked to Armanda with cruel satisfaction. "She's ruined. And so are you." Armanda felt the blood drain from her face. The guests in the doorway whispered frantically, their eyes wide with scandal and delight. Arthur released Edmund with disgust, turning back to Armanda. The vulnerability from moments ago had been replaced by fierce determination. "Then let them see," he said quietly, his words for her alone. "Let them know the truth. All of it." He extended his hand. "Trust me. Please." Armanda looked at his outstretched hand, at the man who had just confessed he'd wanted her for months, at the scandal erupting around them, and made her choice. She placed her hand in his. Arthur led Armanda back into the ballroom with her hand firmly clasped in his. The moment they appeared, the whispers that had been building exploded into open chaos. Edmund stood at the center of the room, positioned like a prosecutor before a jury, his voice carrying with calculated precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, I feel it is my duty, my painful duty, to reveal a deception that has been perpetrated upon this house and upon society itself." Arthur's grip on Armanda's hand tightened, but he didn't stop walking, didn't hesitate. He moved through the crowd with lethal purpose, guests parting instinctively before him. "This woman," Edmund continued, gesturing toward Armanda with theatrical disgust, "is no mysterious foreign lady. She is Miss Armanda Garcia, paid companion to Lady Whitmore, the daughter of a failed merchant. A woman with no family, no fortune, no claim whatsoever to the position she has fraudulently occupied tonight." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Lady Cordelia stood beside her son, her expression triumphant. "She has manipulated my cousin," Edmund declared, his voice rising. seduced him into this absurd charade, no doubt hoping to trap an earl into marriage through scandal and— Enough. Arthur's single word cut through Edmund's speech like a blade through silk. The ballroom fell instantly silent. Arthur released Armanda's hand, only to step directly between her and Edmund, his posture radiating controlled fury. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the vast room with devastating clarity. You stand in my home, Edmund. You eat my food, drink my wine, and enjoy my hospitality, and you dare— His voice dropped to something infinitely more dangerous. You dare to insult the woman I have chosen. Chosen? Edmund laughed, though it sounded forced. Arthur, be reasonable. She's a nobody who— You insult my fiancée, Arthur said, his voice rising to thunder that made several guests flinch. You insult your Earl. The words rang through the ballroom like a church bell. Lady Cordelia stepped forward, her face pale. Arthur, you cannot possibly— This is madness. Think of your position, your duty to the family. I have thought of nothing else for months. Arthur turned slowly, addressing the entire assembly. His hand found Armanda's again, pulling her to his side. Yes, Miss Garcia was Lady Whitmore's companion. Yes, her father was a merchant. Yes, she has no title, no grand fortune, no political connections to offer. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the stunned faces. And I have never wanted anything more in my entire life than to make her my wife. The ballroom erupted into shocked exclamations, fans snapping open, gentlemen muttering, ladies gasping behind gloved hands. Edmund's face had gone red with rage. You would throw away centuries of tradition, the family standing for a— Choose your next word very carefully, Arthur warned, his voice lethal. Edmund's mouth snapped shut. Arthur turned to face the assembled guests fully, still holding Armanda's hand as if it were a lifeline. I will marry Miss Garcia by Christmas morning. Anyone who has objections may direct them to me personally, though I suggest you consider whether your opinion matters more than my happiness. This is a scandal, Lady Cordelia hissed. The family will be ruined. Then let it be ruined. Arthur's voice was steel wrapped in ice. I would rather burn every bridge in society than spend one more day pretending to care about their approval. He turned to Armanda, and his expression softened impossibly, all the fury melting into something tender and vulnerable. If you'll have me. Armanda stared at him, overwhelmed, terrified, but certain of one truth that burned through all her fear. This man had just chosen her, over everything, his family, his reputation, society's approval. Yes, she whispered. The ballroom exploded into chaos, some guests applauding, others expressing outrage, Edmund shouting protests that no one heard over the tumult. Arthur raised Armanda's hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with reverence that silenced the nearest observers. Then let them talk, let them whisper and judge. I don't care. He led her toward the exit, not fleeing but departing with the quiet dignity of a man who had made his choice and would not be moved. Not as an earl with his prop, but as a man with the woman he loved. Armanda woke to pale winter sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the distant sound of church bells ringing Christmas morning across London. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The ball, the kiss, Edmund's confrontation, Arthur's devastating declaration before all of society. She sat up in the enormous bed of Winterstone Manor's finest guest suite, still wearing the silk nightgown Arthur's housekeeper had provided, her mind spinning with impossible questions. What happened now? Had Arthur meant what he said, or would the cold light of morning bring regret? Would he— A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice unsteady. Arthur entered, and Armanda's breath caught. He wore no jacket, no cravat, just shirt sleeves and waistcoat, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. He looked younger somehow, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen him. "I didn't sleep," he admitted, closing the door softly behind him. "I've been pacing the library since we left the ballroom, trying to find the right words. Arthur, let me say this. Please." He crossed to the window seat where she sat and knelt before her, taking her hands in his with careful gentleness. "Last night, I made declarations in front of 200 witnesses. I claimed you as my fiancée, promised to marry you by Christmas morning, essentially declared war on my own family." Armanda's heart thundered. "I know. I'm sorry. I never meant to—" "I'm not apologizing." His thumbs traced circles on her palms. "I'm giving you a choice. The choice I should have offered from the beginning instead of hiding behind arrangements and rules." He took a breath, and Armanda saw genuine fear flicker in his dark eyes. "If your heart is uncertain, we will end this now. I will tell society it was a misunderstanding. I will ensure you're provided for. I will—" His voice cracked slightly. "I will let you go, if that's what you want." "And if I don't want that?" Armanda whispered. Arthur's eyes blazed with sudden hope. "Then take my hand now, truly, freely, without obligation or pretense, and I promise you a lifetime of choosing you. Every morning, every decision, every moment. You will never be invisible again, Armanda. Not to me, not to anyone." Armanda looked at this man who had seen her when no one else had, who had defended her against his own family, who knelt before her, now offering everything he had. She placed her hand in his. "I choose you," she said softly. "I think I've been choosing you since the moment you asked me to look at you as if I belonged to you, and I realized I wanted to." Arthur closed his eyes briefly, as if in prayer, then stood and pulled her into his arms. "Thank God. I thought I might have to resort to more desperate measures." "Such as?" "Begging." He smiled against her hair. "I'm not above it where you're concerned." 3 hours later, in the private chapel of Winterstone Manor, Armanda Garcia became Armanda Torres, Countess of Winterstone. The ceremony was simple. Just the vicar, Mrs. Henshaw as witness, and young Thomas the footman who wept openly throughout. No grand society wedding, no hundreds of guests, just two people choosing each other in the quiet morning light of Christmas. When the vicar pronounced them married, Arthur cupped Armanda's face with both hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "My first rule still stands," he murmured, his eyes warm with affection and something deeper, something that looked remarkably like love. "What rule?" Armanda asked, though she already knew. "Stay close to me." He kissed her softly, reverently. "Always, always," she promised against his lips. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing Winterstone Manor in white. Inside, the Earl and his new Countess stood together in the chapel, and for the first time in her 22 years, Armanda understood what it meant to be truly seen, truly chosen, truly loved. Not as a companion, not as a deception, not as a means to an end, but as herself, wholly, completely, permanently. Arthur took her hand and led her from the chapel into their new life together, and Armanda realized that the greatest gift she'd received this Christmas wasn't a title or a fortune or even the grand romance she'd never dared to dream of. It was being chosen by a man who saw her, really saw her, and decided she was worth everything. "Merry Christmas, Lady Winterstone," Arthur whispered. Armanda smiled, squeezing his hand. "Merry Christmas, my lord." And for the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She was home. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.